Thank you so much. I know this is a very popular panel. I'm honored to be here, so I want to get right to it. I'm nervous. Katie Court's in the room. Thank you so much. I think this is the most important topic, and we have such a special panel. Michael Stratmanis is with us from the Obama Foundation. Richard Reeves is here, president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, and future
Hi, everybody.
I already screwed up. Governor of Maryland, Wes Moore. Before we start, I want to have this conversation with the understanding that this is a safe space, and not a safe space in that we're going to make sure we don't hurt anybody's feelings. A safe space in that we can say real, honest, practical things that could offend someone, because we all have the collective goal of making sure our boys aren't just okay, but they're thriving. Because I personally think we don't talk about them enough. Yep. So Richard, let's start with you. What does it mean to be a boy in 2024?
Well, I'm not a boy anymore, in case that's not obvious to the crowd, but I have raised 3 sons, all in their 20s now, which is one of the reasons I think I'm drawn to this work. And I think the very fact that that doesn't have an obvious answer anymore, that's a box with a big question mark in it now. And a lot of boys are struggling with that. And I would say that the best answer to that is probably not to tell, but to show. And what we should be showing is that mature masculinity, which is a phrase I much prefer to thinking about toxic and non-toxic, which maybe we'll get into, is actually just about being generative. I think I've tried to raise my boys. I think we should try to raise our sons that actually just being for yourself is the opposite of masculinity. That masculinity and being a boy is about relationships. It's about being generative. It's about giving more than you get. And so there's this online movement, some of you may have heard of, called the Men Going Their Own Way movement. It's like a male separatist movement, basically saying, oh, screw this, I'm off, everyone hates me. Men going their own way aren't men at all, in my view. Is that men who are in communities, in families, who are kind of giving more than they get, that's what I think it means. That's what I think the aspiration should be. But I honestly think a lot of boys right now don't have a good answer, and so they go looking online for an answer and find some pretty bad ones, honestly.
Michael?
You know, I find, and we saw this in the Obama White House, we did something that was interesting. We took a look at the well-being of the American people, and then particularly the well-being of young people. And we disaggregated it by race and gender. And what we found was pretty staggering, that on the bottom of every good statistic and at the top of every bad statistic were boys and young men of color. And it didn't correlate to income. It didn't correlate to neighborhood. There was something there that cut across those lines. And what we found is that our young men, and particularly our young boys, particularly of color, and this happens in Indian country, this happens in Black and Latino communities with Asian communities, find themselves in communities that are not designed to support them at a very young age. Just one thing that we found that makes a huge difference, and I wonder if you saw this. We'll skip you, so you didn't grow up here. If you, Governor Moore, how many male teachers of color you had in your school? I had one. He was actually a guidance counselor, and I spent a lot of time with him. And we found that just having a teacher at a kindergarten age, before 3rd grade, gives a young person of color the opportunity to really, for the first time, learn that they can be successful in school. Just that simple thing. You know, if you go to and I'll end with this. If you go to any of the schools around the Presidential Center site where we're building the Presidential Center in Chicago, you see kids around 10, 11, 12 years old who know, because they're smart, that their schools and their communities have given up on them, that they don't think they can be successful. And if that's what you learn at 10 or 11 or 12, you have to make a choice about how you're going to define success for yourself. And as Richard describes, there's an entire world out there that will give you a message as to whose fault it is that you're not successful, who you can depend on, who your enemies are, and the community that will support you. And we find that those communities are not the ones that can give our young people the opportunity to be the citizens that we need them to be. And that's something that we're looking to tackle.
Wes?
I echo what both Richard and Straught said. It's I think part of the challenge is that we've got a lot of young boys who are kind of figuring out on their own, and their definition of manhood is one that they are developing in real time, depending on who is in front of them and helping them to develop that definition of manhood. I remember I thought about this where when I was younger, I had a chance to go to South Africa, and I lived in a township called Langa. And while I was there, my homestay brother was going out for essentially a manhood ceremony. And what they would do is they would all go out into the bush. On the first day, all the boys were circumcised, and then they would spend the next weeks healing, physically healing, but also learning about their history, learning about what it means to be a Xhosa man and the history of the Xhosa battles and who the other Xhosa individuals were, like Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. And they'd learn this history, and then after this process of around 3 weeks, they would then come back to community, and they would all be dressed in white. They would return back to their neighborhoods, and there would be a huge feast for them, because the idea was that a boy left, but that a man has come back. And they understood what that meant. They understood the responsibility that it meant for their families, the responsibility that it meant for their communities. I think about it in many ways where, I had friends who had bar mitzvahs, the same type of thing, where you come up and you have this experience of you're making this journey into manhood. And I feel like part of the thing that has to be understood is that, unfortunately, for a lot of boys as they're coming up, if you ask them, what does it mean to be a man, you're going to get a multitude of different answers. And because it's the answers that everything in their environments are very much informing them. And it goes back to something that when I wrote this book called The Other West 4, and I remember speaking with him once about it, and I asked him, do you think that we're products of our environments? And he actually said to me, and this is a person who's now serving a life sentence in prison, and he said to me, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought to myself that he was right, that we weren't products of our environments, we were products of our expectations. And part of the challenge is that for a lot of young boys, they're coming up into this journey into manhood, and the expectations that are being laid out for them are not necessarily the hopes or expectations that society, that we would want for them to be able to embrace, and then that becomes the tension.
Mm-hmm. But aren't some of them coming up in an age where the world's mad at them? We have boys right now that are being scolded for toxic masculinity on a regular basis before they can even spell masculinity. And we're never finding the space, Richard, to say that masculinity or being an alpha male isn't a crime, but we're not giving them that path.
Yeah. I think it's really important that we understand why that happened, though, because one of the reasons people are afraid even to have this conversation, right? So the title of this session is, Are We Failing Our Boys and Men? And one way to think about that is think about policies, the structures of our education system, and we could get into that for sure, but I think one of the biggest ways we're failing them is in the way we talk about it, the way we talk about them, the way we explain their problems, very often by putting it on them. And so if they're struggling at school, it's because they don't try hard enough. If they're struggling with their health, it's because they don't look after themselves well enough. And so we individualize what we would otherwise maybe see as structural problems. And so the problems that boys have, that with boys, are very often turned into problems of boys. It's like, what's wrong with you? And so we treat boys in the school system sometimes like malfunctioning girls. All right? And so we use that as a default. And I do think at its worst, it blurs into almost this slur, I'm afraid it's become sometimes, of toxic masculinity. But the reason for that is because we've had so long when we've had to fight, and we continue to have to fight for women and girls.
But it's not a 10-year-old boy today's fault. And the history that you're
Right.
talking about, he didn't grow up with.
No.
He doesn't know
He's
anything about it.
he's
but we're
mystified
putting
by
it on him
Right.
Of all that his forefathers did to oppress other people. And he's 10.
But that's the problem then if they go online or they end up, we're all alluding to where they might get these answers from, which is, I think you just said, they'll find someone who'll explain it to them and they'll say, the most successful online reactionary figures say, you're struggling because they hate you, they being the feminists, and we should go back, right? And what they hear too often from more progressive or center-left audiences about their problems is deafening silence. Because we're afraid that by talking about the problems of boys and men, people will think we're somehow against women and girls, that it's a zero-sum game, that we're only allowed to think one thing at once. In fact, the Surgeon General talked beautifully about this recently, where he said, I've got a son and a daughter. The idea I'd care more about one of them, or the idea that because I love one, I love the other one less. But that zero-sum frame has become very crippling. And so if the boys don't hear positive messages about masculinity, they only hear it framed either in a negative way or a reactionary way. So sure, many reactionaries want to turn back the clock on women. Sure. But a lot of progressives feel like they're turning their back on men or blaming them for their own problems. And that's a very difficult environment.
Wes, what do you think?
I think it's right that we have to be able to strike a better balance. Oftentimes, even if you look at policies and things put in place, it's oftentimes about the repairing of boys, how we need to be fixed, how we need to be healed, how we need to do better. And it is important because we cannot pretend like they're not listening. We couldn't pretend like I wasn't listening. An idea that somehow you were a deficiency that needed to be fixed. And it was interesting. I was talking with, I was in a barbershop. I was taking my son. I just go for the conversations now at this point.
I was just saying,
I just go hanging out. Actually. I was taking my son.
How much do you pay? How much do you pay?
Oh, I got the cheapest haircuts on earth. But it was interesting because we were talking about this actually more so in a political context, because they were having this conversation about what's going on. Are black men going to participate in this election, and what's happening with voter rates and all that kind of stuff. And someone said something I thought was really interesting, where he said we put so much of a focus on supporting and uplifting black girls, which was so important because we've gone for so long with essentially taking black girls and women for granted, and a measure of neglect. And the idea that, frankly, we all of us, and I don't care where we come from, what we represent, every single one of us, we stand on the shoulders of black women and the contributions that black women have made to our society. But the point that he made was actually really interesting. He said, and this is a person who had sons and daughters, and he's like, I see how all this stuff is about how to uplift my daughters. And he said, and it's been amazing to me how I just don't see that for my sons. And how my sons are spoken about like they are a deficiency. And he said, I fear we don't want to turn black girl magic into black boy tragic. That we have to make sure that we're coming up with a way of being able to celebrate these boys, who they are, what they hope for, what they aspire to be, and that our society needs them. Because if you do not embrace that, if we have policies that are put in place to essentially to fix, if you have language that is being used to curtail a measure of creativity, then we are going to have measurements of unintended consequences that we are not and have not put enough thought into how exactly we deal with those kind of consequences.
I'm so glad you're saying this, Strat, because I guarantee right now there are laundry baskets in Wes's house and my house that have T-shirts in it that say the future is female, girl power, black girl magic, and they're amazing. But our boys' laundry is in those same baskets. How do we make sure they're not left out? Because those messages are being conveyed to them all day, every day.
The reason why I wanted to participate in this panel is because I wanted to be a part of something that I think is going to define whether or not we're going to be able to meet the challenges of our time. we are going to have a both-and conversation. That's right. We are going to have to be able to be for our women and do everything we can to make sure that our women can become the leaders that we need them to be in all aspects of society. And at the same time, be able to provide the specific interventions that we need for our boys and young men. Yes. We are not going to succeed without it, because there are financial forces, political forces, societal forces that are built on the division and the anger. So we've got to stand for this and risk having this dialogue. Just one thing that comes to mind for me is we think about, one of the ways we're measuring success in communities for particularly our children of color, our boys of color, is, are they entering school ready to learn? Right? Are they enrolled in a high quality preschool? But one of the measures that we've had to take on is reducing out of school suspensions for 2- and 3-year-old boys. Yep. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that they are being seen at 2 and 3 years old as dangerous, as unmanageable, as people who need to be removed from a classroom in order for the instructor and the rest of the students to feel safe. Now, that carries through, and they know that. We're sending that message. They've heard that maybe from their families. They've heard that from the society, and the one place they think they can be nurtured and safe sees them as dangerous and would want to remove them from the classroom when they probably act as unruly boys. And I think the part of what I think has to happen is we have got to change this narrative. Wes, I know you felt this way. I felt we've got all kinds of tools now that we use, from how we dress to who's around us, so that we don't code danger. Mm-hmm. I went for a walk this morning. I went for a walk this morning at 6 a.m., something I do in my neighborhood every single morning. And as I started walking through the neighborhoods of Aspen, I had to think, am I going to be safe here? Because I knew that people might react to me and feel unsafe because of my presence. Because I'm an over 6 foot, heavy-set black guy.
I don't think you're heavy-set.
I'm working on it. My wife's here, and she wants me to let go of that. So I'm gonna let go of it here. I'm working on it.
He's on a panel with Wes. So.
And so I think we've got to help send a different message.
Yes.
Not just to our young people, but to society at large. That no, we need you if we're going to be able to provide the jobs of the future. We need you if we're going to be able to tell stories that bind us together. We need you if we're going to be able to raise and heal our women. We need you to be successful, and we're going to listen to you as to what you need to be successful in this society.
This idea of rising together and the future being female and male as equal partners is, I think, at the center of this conversation. But I can't help building on your comment about coding. This is one of these, as you pointed out, I didn't grow up here. I'm a new US citizen, but my godson is 6'5", black, grew up in Baltimore, and he turns up one day, he sells cars for a living, with glasses on, very like yours. I said, hey, you're getting old. He said, no, they're clear lenses. I don't need them. I just sell more cars this way because white people trust me more. Turns out, this is well known.
It's well known.
Well known, right? Turns out almost no white people in America know about this, but pretty much every black person in America knows about this. And that criminal defense lawyers will use it. They call it the nerd defense, which is if you want to make a black man seem less threatening, put spectacles on him that he doesn't need. So that's the moment where you think, well, maybe it's our eyesight that needs adjusting, not his, and especially for black men, and that intersection they've talked about. And this other coding that's happening now, and it's this kindergarten thing, is one of the reasons that at the Institute we're doing so much work on male teachers, and in particular the imbalance around male teachers of color, but more generally, is I really worry that if boys see the teachers are women, and it's down to 23% men now, from 33%, and they see the girls doing better. Colleges are now much more female-oriented than they were male-oriented when we passed Title IX. It's flipped. The education itself gets coded as female. 2% of kindergarten teachers, at most, maybe 1 or 2% of kindergarten teachers are men. We have 3 or 4
because
times
it's not
as many
considered
women.
okay for men,
No.
or hasn't
Meanwhile,
been before.
we have 3 times as many women as a share of the profession flying fighter planes as men teaching kindergarten. To be clear, I am all about the investments the US military is making to make sure that women can fly our fighter jets. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest it is at least as important that we have more men in our classrooms. And I just don't see the effort going into that right now. Where are the policies? Where's the investment? Where is the, when every year we publish the data showing the share of male teachers going down, where's the outcry? Where's the discussion? Where are the New York Times pieces about it? We shrug our shoulders and move on. We would not do that if it was the other way around.
The investments happen in Maryland, to be clear, by the way.
Here we go.
I'm just saying.
It starts in Maryland. Hey, Maryland.
Does it go further into how we define masculinity? When you think of who you are as a husband and a father and what your kids see you do at home, right? I think about all the work Jessica Seinfeld does with the Good Plus Foundation and helping men, helping fathers actually be engaged with their children and know how to support them. Do we need to change the way we think of male roles, right? We want all of these women to have the highest educations and the biggest jobs, but when a man stays home, we're still kind of wiggling our nose going, what's up with him? Don't we have to change that?
Here's the thing. I take a sense of pride in the fact that I am my family's protector. I take a sense of pride that, as my wife says, who's standing right there, she says, I never feel safer than when my husband's around me. I take pride in that. I take pride in the fact that I can be a provider and a protector for my children. I take pride in the fact that even if you think about, if you think about the Bible and biblical, about how the man needs to take a role in a household, I take pride in that. And so I don't think that, I actually don't think that the idea of saying we have to lift up and embrace our women and the roles that they play, the importance they play in our families, the importance they play in our society, and also saying, and we are asking our men and our boys to take a sense of pride in the fact that they have to take a sense of leadership in their families. They have to take a sense of pride and leadership in their communities. That it's not something that we should shy away from. I actually don't think that these have to be mutually exclusive goals. And I don't see me lifting up my wife as minimizing me. Nor does she ever think that her lifting up her husband is in some way diminishing her role. I think there's an importance in both of us lifting each other up. That is the intention, that is the goal, and that's what I think all of us should be able to aspire towards.
Sure. Can I maybe just add, I don't know if I'm adding or disagreeing, but I'll pretend that I'm adding because that's more polite. The first thing is, my wife doesn't say that about me. But I'm not a former US paratrooper. Something to do with it. She would say it about you. but actually, I agree with everything you've said about being partners and rising together. I was a stay-at-home dad for a while. My wife was doing a very, very, very high-intensity job, and we kind of agreed we wanted to share child-rearing together. And I think I was as much of a partner and a provider to our family during that period as any other period because it
gave... Do you think society felt that about you?
I think we have a way to go, and actually, A, paid leave would be great, and B, paid leave for dads would be nice, too. The military has that now, but let's have it for dads, and but it takes more of a... And the reason is because it enabled her to focus on what she was doing right then, and I was engaged, and I was in the community, and I was doing all that. And I think I'm going to take the risk of saying what I think women want, which is always dangerous on a panel like this, but I actually think there's something to be said, like women want partners. They want men who are kind of with them, who are going to pay equal effort. And maybe that will allow them to be more of a traditional protector provider. In many cases, there is nothing wrong with that. We should never pathologize that. But sometimes they can provide love and energy. And they can provide by being a stay-at-home dad while you pursue your career, etc., right? And so we've got to expand these ideas of provider and protector, I think, and bring them up to date for the modern world. Because I've got to tell you, whatever society was telling me, I didn't feel any less like a man raising my own kids, raising my own boys. And any society or institution that tells you you are is our enemy.
You know, there's this great program in Chicago. It's called the Dovetail Project. And they work with young men who are justice involved, I think is the word you'd call it, is the phrase you'd use now, who want to be great fathers. And a couple things. They found, at least in Chicago, that black non-custodial fathers are more involved with their children's lives than any other demographic.
That's right.
So they're participating in their present. So we have to get rid of that myth.
Yeah.
Of the absent father in that way. But, and I experienced this in my own life, my father left our family before I was born. I know that we can work across divides because my mom remarried this long-haired Latvian immigrant who adopted me, and I took his name, and so he loves me, so I know that that's true. But but because of that experience, I didn't have, and I find these young people in the Dovetail Project don't have, the knowledge and the skill set, and therefore the sense of efficacy in how to be a father. And so society gives them the opportunity to just kind of stand back. They want to participate, but they don't want to make any mistakes.
Yeah.
They don't want to screw up their kids' lives because they feel like what they got, perhaps from their families, wasn't the best. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that, you know, that carries in our DNA, right? You know, I don't know where my father got his perspective on being a young father at the time, but having grown up black in America and having come to Chicago through the Great Migration, I don't know what his father went through. And I don't even know if his great-grandfather even could have had a family or stayed connected to his wife and his children, right? So we carry that with us. But the beautiful thing about us as human beings is we can heal from that and write a new story, and we have not just generational trauma, we can have generational healing. And so we can turn these young people like this program does. They are now the heroes in their society. They're the heroes back in their neighborhood because they're the ones, non-custodial, coming out of prison, coming back to their community, choosing to become the leaders and present in their families, and are given the skill sets. So, you know, changing diapers, dealing with a raucous child, trying to set boundaries and set limits. They've got tools for how to do that and how to participate, not only as fathers, but also as spouses. And so I think if we choose to take this on, what we'll find is these young people will do more than we expected them ever to do because they're beautiful human beings just like everybody in this room.
Then let's stay in the beauty, because we're talking in large part today about what are we missing when it comes to our boys, or how are we failing them. Think back to when you were just a boy, and all that we're trying to do now. Is it better to be a boy today than when you were a child? Because I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of people talking about empathy or addressing your emotions or expressing your emotions when you were 5 and 6 years old. Maybe your family was, but society wasn't, and the education system wasn't. And at least we're talking about it.
Yeah. No, you know, it's fair, and so, you know, from my background, I was raised by an immigrant single mom, and a woman who didn't get her first job that gave her benefits until I was 14 years old. You know, some of my earliest memories was I watched my dad die in front of me when I was 3 because he didn't get the health care he needed. And so I came up in a way where my earliest memories were watching systems fail us, and then had to figure out how to navigate this world. And to be very honest, and like, listen, my mother, you I always say that God's greatest gift that he ever gave me was the day that he asked Joy Moore to give birth to me. It was the greatest gift I ever could have gotten. I also know that there were certain things that she could not teach me about going into manhood because she had not experienced that. She needed help. She needed supports. And you are right that honestly, coming up in communities and frankly a society that was not there to help, that was actually there and in many ways was causing harms and making that navigation, making that journey that much trickier. It is powerful that we are being able to talk about it, that we're able to embrace it, that we're able to discuss this and understand the dynamic and the challenges. I just think we also have to be very honest that so many of the obstacles that are sitting in front of our boys right now, they are systemic. And stories like mine shouldn't have to be exceptions, but they are. And so when we are, and I think about it coming from, a world of philanthropy, and I'll give a shout out to Rich Bury, who's my successor over at Robinhood and is doing amazing work over at Robinhood. And we continue to realize that, every single year we're making investments of hundreds of millions of dollars into elements that focus on everything from food insecurity and housing insecurity and educational supports and all this kind of stuff. But there's a reason why. The reason that we have so many programs that invest in food insecurity is because we have so many people who are food insecure. The reason we have programs that invest in housing insecurity is because we have so many people who are housing insecure. The reason we can have programs that are supporting boys, and specifically boys of color, making this journey into manhood is because we have so many boys of color who feel like they are doing it on their own. And so we actually have to be courageous enough to actually look at some of these systems, policies that we have in place, because we're never going to have enough support systems or philanthropy. There's not enough philanthropy in the world to be able to fix that we continue to have young boys who feel like they're navigating this world and seemingly are doing it on their own. Because they don't feel like they're coming up in communities or societies or policy frameworks that are in place to support them. They're really more in place to control them.
Yes.
But it's worse than our boys are doing it on their own. They're doing it with the help of the internet.
Yeah.
Richard, talk about how dangerous that is as the roadmap or the guide or almost in some ways this surrogate parent for our children. We talk about the impact it has on our girls. The impact it has on our boys is equally as devastating.
Sometimes it might be because there aren't people in their lives showing rather than telling, role models, so they go looking. It could also be that just a lot of young men and boys feel like the things they're struggling with, they almost feel like you don't have permission to ask about them and to talk about them. They kind of fear that it won't be taken as seriously.
But they don't have to, because the internet is there waiting with unlimited pornography.
Sure. Or advice on, quotes, modern masculinity. Google, like, how should I be? And very often what happens is they're looking for stuff that's kind of benign to start with. It's dating advice. It's kind of fitness advice. It's like, how do I get a friend? We have this huge crisis in loneliness, particularly for kind of men. So they're looking for connection, they're looking for advice. And very often what happens, partly because of the way the algorithms work, they end up with someone who actually might have some quite good advice about some of those things, but then leave it in
That's the first link.
Invite them in, or then follow with a story which is basically, you're struggling, they don't care, come to me, reaction. It's the rise of women is what's causing your problems. And so they're invited into an analysis of what's happening, which gives some sort of sense of an explanation for what they're doing. We need an alternative explanation, which is, yes, you are struggling, and maybe our schools need to do better for you, and yes, we're going to help you, rather than turn it into this kind of zero-sum game that they get online. But I think it's a profound mistake for us not to recognize the search. If we don't like the answers, that's good, but why are so many of our men on that search? And if we are failing to provide better answers in a compassionate and an open and a non-zero-sum way, it is our fault that they go looking somewhere else. And so I love this panel. I love the fact we're having this conversation, because I just feel like if more boys and young men hear men like this, talking like this, you cannot overestimate the power of that. Because so many of them just want to feel seen and heard, and so many of the people online make them feel seen and heard. That turns out to be magic right now for young boys and men to feel that their problems are being taken seriously. So how about we take them seriously and cut off the supply lines to the misogynists online?
Well, the first thing I would say is you don't know this, so I'll say it here. I want to thank you for your research on loneliness, because I did not realize that I was lonely and had not paid attention to my male friendships until we were on a panel together. I had to read your book. And my wife, basically pointed out the difference between what her definition of friendship is by what she does with her friends, and what I seem to be doing with my friends, which did not seem to meet the same definition, same standard. And I did not want to end up, as one of those like lonely old men who had spent so much of their their time focused on family and career and not really valuing friendship. So I just want to thank you. I just want to thank you for that. I think what we see is that the boys, and particularly the young men, that we find, and I think we saw this in the pandemic in Chicago and other cities around the world, or particularly around the United States, where all of a sudden in downtown and in other communities that used to be immune to this, there was all these young people who were acting out, and there was this outcry about how dangerous things were. And I think what I heard from the people who lived in the communities where these young men lived was like, welcome to the party. This is the neighborhood and the community we've been living in and living with for such a long time. That's number one. I think number two, jobs and opportunities for these young people to do something productive has always consistently been an effective answer, right? Because all they want to do is the same thing you wanted to do, which is live out their dreams. Make a couple bucks to be able to enjoy life and do the things they want to do and build the skills so that they can have the life that they see on the internet and on television, right? We've sort of, one of the things that happened, you were asking whether it's better to grow up as a young person now than when I was young. I say now for sure, because I saw so many cousins, friends, and neighbors who were smart as me, smarter than me, had talent that I didn't have, get dropped off the side, hit a pothole. Things that I avoided because of my mother, because of teachers, because of grace, and because of dumb luck. And I look back and I know that I am an outlier because I look around me at the people who I grew up with and I don't see them anymore. They're gone. They're either dead or they're out of society. And so I think the opportunity we have is to move, and you're doing this through your research, and Governor, you're doing this through your work, is we know we can run a great program for young boys or young people, right? You can go and throw a rock at any community, and I think this is a good thing. And you can find a program that does mentorship or uses sports or helps young people, with their homework. But we have not yet accepted that our standard of success has to be population level change. We've got to stop highlighting just these great individual programs while the graduation rates in these communities are at 40, 30, 20%. A great program can't be the success anymore. Can we do what Yonkers did and move those graduations to 90%? Can we do what Omaha did and cut homicides in these communities in half? Can we do what the mayor Baraka has done in Newark, which is change the definition of Newark, which used to be literally called the murder capital of America, to have murders and homicides down in the teens and a rate of closing open cases in the 90%. So that can happen if we set that standard. And I'm kind of sick of just celebrating these great programs. I want to celebrate them. We need to support them. But can we set our sights a little bit higher and change outcomes for communities?
Wes, when did things get political in this sphere, right? So there's a lot of young men right now we're starting to see kind of veer to the right. And in the misinformation machine, there's this idea of what masculinity is, and maybe, well, one political party is focused on inclusion. That inclusion is leaving out that masculine male. How do you solve for that? Because it's just not true, but it's being fed to young men, and some are going down that path, the path that Richard started talking about, men going off on their own. It's absurd, but it's true, and it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know when it hasn't been political, because I think the separation has always been politically advantageous. Being able to exclude particularly boys of color, isolationism, and we're talking about literally since the inceptions of this country, a separation, a breaking apart of families and fabrics. I don't know a point when this was not a political phenomenon. I actually think that the way that we have to be able to think about this is when we talk about a natural inclusion being a societal benefit. That's actually how we begin to alter and change this narrative. A need and a necessity for men of color, for black men and boys to be able to be active, growing participants within our society, because it's going to help the entire society grow. You know, I think about what you said, Straw, and I think that's really important, because I think it comes back to, for example, what we're seeing right now in Baltimore, where Baltimore and many people and the narrative around Baltimore of The Wire and all this kind of stuff, and the reality is that there is a hidden truth in so much of that narrative that you see within Baltimore. That Baltimore did go 8 straight years where you had 300 plus homicides in a city that used to be a city of 920,000 people, now it's a city of just shy of 600,000 people. But still, the thing that was not declining, while the population was declining, the homicide rate was not, right? And then by going in and saying we need to have a direct change of focus, and not just in terms of the image, not just in terms of the realities, but the images of the participation that we see for black boys. And being able to really shift that to say that when we're talking about focusing on public safety, that does not mean militarize our way out of this. It means creating new opportunities for our boys. That when we're talking about economic growth, that actually if you want to have an economically growing society, make sure that you have more people participating in that society. And so there has been a direct correlation now between what we've seen, that Baltimore now, right now, has the 8th fastest growing economy in this entire country. That Baltimore right now has had the steepest drop in homicides of any major American city in this country. That Baltimore right now, the homicide rate has dropped so significantly in the city of Baltimore. The last time the homicide rate has been this low in the city of Baltimore, I was not born yet. That's the kind of drops that we're seeing. But what's happening? Not just greater levels of participation that we're seeing within our communities and our societies, but a change in the psychology. For our young boys who now understand that nothing is going to be impossible for you, and that you have a society that's actively rooting for you, that you have a society that's going to invest in you, that you have a society that sees you in a way that has not seen you before. And so we have to be able to understand and shape it, and to your point, break apart this political, because it's always been politically advantageous to disregard black men and boys. Always. And so if we can actually shape our society to show that you're going to have a growing and a sustainable society, when we can have a society where everybody is seen and included inside that larger equation, then that's the benefit of participatory economics, that's the benefit of economic growth.
Richard, how do we do that? The important work that Wes is talking about, while at the same time ensure that there's not an alt-right website right now with a guy with a short haircut and an American flag behind him saying to my sons, "You're not going to get into college because a black teenage girl is." That's not true, but that's what scores of young men are being told, and they're finding their way down an alt-right path. And what we need to do is get to the first thing you all talked about, which is how do we solve for all of it together?
The failure to acknowledge the problems we're talking about here, these structural problems in education, in mental health, to acknowledge them and to say that we're dealing with them creates the very opportunity you've talked about, which is that they will then go looking somewhere else. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When COVID hit, the college enrollment rate dropped 7 times more for men than for women. You didn't read that anywhere. It was impossible to get coverage of that because it was no one's job to be drawing attention to that. It's one of the reasons I create this new organization. And I'm getting a little bit harder on Democrats at a national level than Governor Moore is being right now. I think at a state level, you're seeing Wes, you're seeing Republicans like Spencer Cox creating work on boys and men. You're seeing Washington State consider a commission on boys and men. But at a national level, actually, it is really hard, actually, even to get them to acknowledge the fact that we have these huge problems facing boys and men. Most tragically, perhaps, and the Surgeon General's recent work speaks to this, the tragedy and the crisis of male suicide in this country. We are losing 40,000 men a year to suicide. Yep. That's about the same number as women die from breast cancer, just to put it in perspective, not to compare them that way. Gun deaths, which Vivek just talked about, 6 times as many men. Black men more homicide, white men more suicide, etc. These are very distinctly male problems.
School shooters.
But they're not addressed in that way. There's a genuine feeling at a national level that simply to admit that that's a problem is to give a gift to the alt-right. They'll say, aha, you see, even they admit that male suicide's a problem. The problem is, it is a problem. And so if you're not talking about it, from the White House, from HHS, etc. Donald Payne, tragically lost, a member of Congress from New Jersey, put down a bill to create an Office of Men's Health. We have many offices of women's health doing great work. He died at the age of 65, African-American man from complications with diabetes. We should rename that bill in his honor, and the White House should come out in favor, because the idea that when we are losing so many men to so many health problems that we can't have an Office of Men's Health and offices of women's health is exactly the kind of thing that is a recruiting tool for the right. So let's stop giving them the gift of this issue. But that will require us to talk about it, and Wes is talking about it, but I've got to tell you, above his level, on the left, pretty hard to get anyone to talk about it.
I want to open it up to some questions. Oh.
Wow. Oh, no, there aren't any.
We're going to give you a microphone.
Going back to your former life in your adopted city of New York, what would you recommend that the New York City public school system specifically do in the Bronx, which includes the poorest congressional district in the United States, to improve the outcome for black and brown students?
I think about the work that we're doing right now, which in many ways has been completely informed by some of the best practices and things that we saw when I was in Robin Hood. One, you've got to start earlier. 80% of brain development happens in a child by the time that child is 5 years old. So the fact that we have children starting school at 5 makes absolutely no sense, biologically nor otherwise. You've got to be able to start earlier. You also have to make sure that issue of lifelong learning and community schools and those type of things, that it actually includes the family, because the best way you're going to support a child is making sure that family is supported. The best way you support that family is making sure that family is existing in a strong supportive community. The best way you support that community is making sure that community has strong supportive anchors inside of that community, to include homes of worship and their schools. And so you have to ensure that you have a full family wraparound when it comes to those type of supports. The other thing that I think we have to be able to do, that we're doing in Maryland, is both making sure we're attracting and recruiting additional teachers of color, men of color, et cetera, into classrooms, because that matters not just qualitatively but quantitatively. But the other big thing is this too. It's how we're thinking about measurements of CTE, career technical education, being able to get young people an understanding of what it is that they want to do earlier. Because I'm just a very big believer. It's the reason why Maryland became the first state in this country that now has a service year option for all of our high school graduates, right? It's the reason why It's the reason why we are focusing on career technical education for our young people, because we do. You know, I was mentioning yesterday, we have some of the best 4-year colleges in America and some remarkable 2-year ones, including Howard Community College as well. But we also have to end this idea and, frankly, myth that every single one of our students must attend a 4-year college in order to be economically successful. And so there's a whole bunch when it comes to holistic lifelong learning that if we can do that sustainably and invest in that sustainably, you're going to be able to move the needle on what are the prospects for our young people who are growing up in communities.
Mr. Capehart?
We can hear you. Believe me.
Jonathan, you don't need a microphone.
We can hear you.
Shut up.
Thank you very much, and you caught me by surprise. Thank you, Stephanie. I wanted to pick up on something that Richard was talking about in saying that the left, it's really difficult in the Democratic Party to raise the things that you're talking about. And the word that kept coming to my mind was the patriarchy. So can we please have a discussion about how do you address that and break through that? Because I think until we have that conversation, that's the wall I think we have to climb over. So Wes, you're governor, you're nodding. I would love to hear your answer.
Well, no, I think it's spot on, Jonathan, because this idea, and you see how it does become politically weaponized. Mm-hmm. And frankly, that you have political campaigns, political races, a current presidential race where the underlying theme, or as our chief of staff says, you know, the note behind the note is this idea of who is the more masculine candidate. Who is the one that is, you know, the chest thumper? And as if that's somehow going to be the thing that is going to appeal to males or boys or inside this larger context. So you're absolutely right that this idea of this patriarchal wall and this historical context of it is completely underlining how we think about all this. I just think that the way we need to be able to identify it is we need to reclaim what that idea of masculinity and what that idea of what it is that we're asking our men and our boys to be. That my idea and my definition of manhood is not the person who's quickest to be the bully or to push someone down. That my definition of manhood isn't the person who has to be the loudest in the room. My definition of manhood is not the person that somehow feels the absolute need to disrespect other people. That's not manhood. Manhood for me is the person who serves that role of protector, of the person who supports others, who lifts up others, who sees the humanity in everybody. The person who understands that they are an important part of the conversation, but they don't have to be the center of the conversation. That idea of being able to lift up, understand a relevancy, but know that that relevancy does not mean exclusion, is how I think we have to recapture and redefine this idea of manhood. And I think that, you know, when we watch these elections or we watch these people who are just being not just opportunistic, but malicious in the way they are trying to shape, define, and refine, there has to be a societal push, individual and societal push, for us to be able to push back on that and to be able to reclaim that with pride and to know that it's not being done because it's interesting, but it's being done because that's the closest to our historical context that we have. And that bastardization that we continue to see every night at every single rally or news conference that he or they hold.
We don't air the rallies anymore.
Thank you. That's not something that we should lift up nor celebrate, nor is that any form of a definition of something that we should be embracing nor loving.
Oh.
Richard?
We should smash the patriarchy, but we should also know what it is and when it's smashed. And I think the problem is that now it's used too loosely. I like the older definition, which is not all men over all women, but actually a society where a small group of men are over everybody else. And I have to tell you, I live in southern Appalachia now, a very kind of poor, rural, kind of white area, and I think probably similarly in some of the areas we've been talking about in black areas of America. Like, the message to those men that they're patriarchs and that they're living in a patriarchy just doesn't land very convincingly. I think the message that we've still got a lot more to do in terms of our leadership, like, look, 25% women in Congress, leadership in business, media, 2% of venture capital money going to women founders. So I think that right at the top of society, that kind of argument that we still don't have enough female representation is very powerful. It's a mistake to take that and say that applies to everybody else. And that creates that implication. Like, if you roll your eyes at a young black man that's struggling in Baltimore or a guy that's struggling with addiction in southern Appalachia, and you just say, well, what's wrong with you? It's a patriarchy. So if you're struggling, it must be your fault. And then we wonder why he might be open to some slightly more reactionary ideas. Or I think, again, we're kind of creating the supply lines to the misogynists by our own failure to take seriously and compassionately these real problems.
Just two things that, I've been hanging around Obama for a while, so the hope thing just comes up. So two areas that I might point you all towards that I think that we see are being successful. I think the first is that people who don't have to use the right words to participate in helping solve a problem. I think right now, if you have to, not only use the word patriarchy, but know what it means and define it in the right way, you're not going to enter into the discussion, even if you have something to offer, right? We're creating a dialogue that is shutting people who want to be a part of this out. And we need them in if we're going to participate. And right now, I don't know, I'm sure the people in this room all love to participate in conversations about politics, but I promise you, most of your neighbors, your family members, and your friends don't. Because they don't feel like there's a place for them in it. They haven't read the latest thing. They haven't listened to the latest podcast. They don't know the latest thing. So they're not in civic life and civic discourse, and we need them in if we're going to solve that problem. And I think we've seen that work. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd offer that might work is there's something really unique about America, and that is we have participated in this interfaith experience. In every hospital right now, there's somebody working on someone, saving their lives, probably of 3 different faiths and 1 person with no faith at all just participating in that challenge. And there's language there of love, of service, of grace, routines and rituals that help people become a man, that offer them an opportunity to participate in society, that are right there for us, I think, to grab a hold of. And people who are going to participate in helping these young people navigate the society that they're in right now with love and affection and grace. And I think there's an opportunity for us to ask those people to participate, maybe to listen and learn from them as well. That is, I think, there's some very fragile things about this country that we've got to fight for and hold on to. The first is, it's still unique in human history to build a society that's not based on might makes right. It is still unique in human history to build on a society where one group of people is not dominant over the other. And it's still pretty unique in human history to build a society where people of different faiths and no faith of all have decided to come together and bring that into the way we live and work together every single day. And I think there's some tools in there for us.
Amen.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.